Hello, everyone. I'm Flora Washington. I really want to welcome you to this episode of the CAYL Catalyst webinar series. We are so delighted to have you here at our July 2026 episode. And the CAYL Catalyst is here to offer you a conversation with key leaders in our field, and we hope that this promotes your personal and professional growth. This year's theme is Reflect for Insight and Reset for Action. And what we're doing this year is we're highlighting leaders who shaped our field and who have explored many ways for us to think about how our field can move forward. Today, we're going to have a conversation with the formidable, influential Elliot Haspel. He's a child and family expert, a policy expert, a writer, and a systems thinker who has helped. Sorry, we're having a few technical difficulties. So, we're here today to welcome Elliot Haspel, who is a family policy expert and a writer, a systems thinker. He's helping us think about how the care ecosystem is really a very important part of what we're doing, and that when it crumbles, everything else in our society falters too. So first of all, I want to remind you that our webinars are free, they're recorded, they're available on our website so that everybody can see them regardless of location or schedule. And if you've joined us today live, we invite you to write in the chat and tell us who you are and where you're from. And if you're joining us today live, we invite you to join us in the after party, which is a live Q&A session where you can actually speak with Elliot Haspel and address any questions or thoughts that you may have. Everyone who's registered for the webinar next week will receive an email from us, which will have the recording, and it will also have related resources to help you explore the things we talk about today even further. So stay involved with the CAYL Institute by following us on social media, looking at our website, or our YouTube channel. So we really want to thank you for making these webinars a really important part of your professional journey. We have had so many thousands of people from all states and a whole lot of countries who join these webinars each month. And so we really appreciate that you show up. If CAYL has been an important part of your learning journey or expanded your community or helped you find your voice, we hope that you will pay it forward by giving a tax-deductible gift of any amount by texting the word CAYL to 53555. As we get ready to hear from Elliot today, we encourage you to ask questions and share your thoughts in the chat. And begin to think about the questions you want to ask Elliot. And to start, here's something you might consider. One of Elliot's core messages seems to be that small shifts create big systems impact. His work always suggests practical ways that we can think about policy change in our work. So as we get ready to listen to Elliot today, write in the chat and let us know, what do you think are some small practical shifts that we might make that might influence and shift policy in the years ahead? And while you're writing, I'm now going to ask Elliot to join me on the screen. Elliot, welcome. We are delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here.
We are so thrilled. And you know what, Elliot, it's really a joy to welcome you to this conversation about the future of children and families and communities and all the work that you've been doing. And we know that the work that we do every day is shaped not only by what's happening in our programs, but it's also shaped by the policies and the culture that is really surrounding us. So I really want to thank you for the leading role that you are playing in our field in terms of bringing ideas to light, helping us to think about the policies that are happening and how we might work to change them. I really enjoyed reading your book, Crawling Behind America's Childcare Crisis and How to Fix It. And I know that many of our listeners have seen you on television. They've seen you on PBS and NPR. They may have read words that you had to say in the New York Times or the Atlantic. And so I think what really is making your voice so great for us in the field is that you're really not just speaking theoretically, but you're talking a lot about real children, real families, real staff members, and this idea you have that small shifts can make a big impact. So I really want to thank you for being that voice in our field, and it has really made a big difference. And I'm thrilled that today we get to learn from you. We get to think about what's possible, and we get to think about our daily leadership and how it can have some of these ripple effects. But before we get started with all of that, I just want to start by asking you if you would mind sharing a little bit of your professional journey and what brings you to this place personally to do this impactful work.
Yeah, well, thank you for those kind of words, and thank you for the invitation. I mean, if my work at all is helpful and additive to the amazing work that's happening with yourself and everyone on this call, and all the other people striving day in and day out to do right by kids and their families, then that's been a good day's work on my end. So I started my career actually in K-12 education. So, I grew up sort of surrounded by both education and government. So my mother was a reading teacher in Title I schools her entire career. My father worked for the federal government. And so I very much like had those two inputs. And when I came out of college, I started my career as a fourth grade public school teacher in Arizona outside of Phoenix. And I really loved that work. I really, really enjoyed, being around the kids, getting to meet the families, like just doing that actual kind of on the ground work day in and day out. And I thought very hard about continuing down that path, but ultimately I decided that, where my kind of talents and interests lay most was in these systems level policy conversations.
Mhm.
How do we make sure not that just a single classroom or a single school is doing right by kids, but that all of the schools, all of the kids are getting what they need. And so I went to the Graduate School of Education up at Harvard. I got a degree in education policy, and for the first few years of my career, I was working in and around kind of school improvement in various sort of roles. But in the early 2010s, I reached this point of starting to get kind of frustrated because we were pouring all of this time and energy and money and person power into school improvement, and schools couldn't be more important. But we really weren't seeing like the systemic change, particularly for children from historically disadvantaged backgrounds. That they continued to have less opportunity just by dint of sort of where they happened to be growing up or the characteristics of their family. And I started asking myself why. Like, well, what are we missing here? Not that schools aren't part of the answer, but if they're not the whole answer, what else is going
Mhm.
on?
Mhm.
And as you know, when you pull up from schools and you start asking about all the different inputs going into child and family flourishing, very, very quickly you end up in the world of early childhood development. Very,
Mhm.
very quickly, you end up in the world of family economic security. And where do family economic security and child development meet is in childcare. So I made a shift at that point in my career to focus more on the early years. And when you arrive at the early years from the K-12 system, a couple of things are true. One is that you're like, this is great, everyone gets it. Like, we're talking about the whole family, we're talking about the whole child, we're
Mhm.
talking about
Mhm.
starting at birth. Like, this makes all the sense in the world. The other thing is you go from a system which is over $800 billion of public money goes into every single year, and which is a constitutional right in every single state constitution, into an area where there is extraordinarily little money, where the educators are paid extraordinarily poorly, and where, at least in the mid 2010s, there was extraordinarily little political and policy attention being paid to it. So that's where I really started to do more of my writing. I try to answer this question of why is it that we treat the first 5 years of life so radically differently than we treat the next 12? Why do we think about the early years in such a fundamentally different way as we think about middle childhood or adolescence in this country? And yeah, so that started me down the path.
Yeah, it's quite a dilemma, isn't it, that the early years are treated so poorly financially, in terms of attention, policy-wise, and in every other way. And you mentioned that you started this in 2010s. I've been doing this work a little longer than that. And I want to tell you that while many wonderful things have happened, some of our fundamental issues have remained the same. The poor pay for our talented, hardworking workforce, the very relatively limited amount of dollars that goes into each child under five compared to what goes into each child in a public school. The fact that parents and their economic security is challenged so much in the childcare system or lack of a system, so that there have been some very common threads that have gone on for decades. So the numbers have changed, and from time to time, the amount of attention that goes to the field improves, but these fundamental issues stay the same. Why is that? What can we do about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're right. I sometimes bring up to people, like the first national childcare staffing study was in 1989, right? And it came out with worthy work, unlivable wages, right? And that was finding literally, 35, 40 years ago, these same issues. You can find, reports in the New York Times in the 1980s and early 1990s about the unaffordability, the lack of childcare, the effect it's having on kids, like the sort of quality issues that are coming from high turnover. It doesn't look that much different. And I think fundamentally, right, the we haven't done in the past 50 years really is change the way we see childcare in this country. We still treat it primarily as an individual family responsibility and not as a collective societal responsibility. And if that flip isn't made, there's a ceiling on almost everything else that we're doing. Because in order to make a claim on the public purse to say, this is deserving of being a right, this is deserving of taxpayer dollars, right? Then you have to sort of conceptually make the argument that has such positive benefits that goes beyond the direct person served, right? That we're going to roll up our taxpayer dollars. We're going to make it available to everyone. So, we have a bucket of things in society where we do that. Schools are a great example. We could also talk about libraries, fire departments, public
Hmm.
parks, roads, right? These things where we say, like, this is part of our social infrastructure. We're going to pay for it with tax dollars. It's going to be free at the point of service to everyone who uses it. Hypothetically, we're going to ask people who make more money to pay more on the back end in taxes, right? And then there's a set of things that we say primarily this is up to you as an individual or as a family, a household to deal with it. And you think about things like acquiring, a car, or if you have a pet, paying for your pet and the expenses that go along with that. No one sort of has a claim on societal help in paying for their pet expenses. And somehow childcare, well, not somehow, it's been very intentional. We can get into it if you want, but through very intentional efforts, childcare has ended up in that sort of a bucket of being a private responsibility, and we're still fighting. Though I think there's some optimism over the past few years that are making some progress, but we're still fighting to get childcare positioned as part of our social infrastructure, where there is a proper claim on government support.
Absolutely. I think one thing that has changed pulling together your career is that we see a lot more pre-K programs in public
Mhm.
schools. There's some recent articles that have been talking about how much principals really knew. And
Yeah.
again, I think they're presenting this as if this is such a great idea. I mean, in the Boston area where we work, the principals have been doing this for decades as well,
Yeah.
really thinking about working into the early years and so forth. So we continue to present ideas as new rather than building upon the infrastructure and the base that has already been established. Why is that?
I think part of it is we're still struggling to make that, in some senses, a moral claim for it. So the pre-K is a great example, right? Like you probably know this history, but for those who don't, coming around the year 2000, there had been an explosion of interest in early childhood brain development. We can actually thank the late Rob Reiner and others for that. And people finally started neurons in neighborhoods, was this
Hmm.
very like sort of meaningful National Academy of Sciences report. So all the evidence was saying basically, look, kids learning starts early. This was around the time of No Child Left Behind. Everyone was concerned about school readiness. And so learning starts early. If you want to have, children prepared for school, we need to start in the early years. And Pew and a few other groups did some polling, and they basically found that like childcare it was a bad brand. It didn't poll very well among the public, and a decision was made strategically that they were going to start attaching the messaging to the education system. So early childhood education, right, which feels like is a different thing than childcare, like as a phrase. We started talking about that much more, very intentionally, not talking about childcare anymore. The Pre-K Now campaign was a $100 million campaign over the course of 10 years to really advance pre-K and the idea of public pre-K that's basically take the school system and go back a year. And it was really, really successful, right? Like we've gone from having just a handful of states with public pre-K systems to 46 states in DC with public pre-K systems, blue states, red states, purple states. Like it's been enormously successful. But it came at a cost. one of those costs was that if you're saying this is pre-K, this is early childhood education, what's the implication? That's childcare. That's not education. That's something different. That's custodial, right? Then I think we're still, instead of making a full-throated argument that said, look, like all of this is care and education, and frankly, schools are also care and education.
Mhm.
Now we need to support both parts of that equation because of all the positive ripple effects it has on our families and our communities and our society, in addition to the economy. We've been making relatively narrow arguments. And so that's part of my contention is that this idea of rights language, everyone should have a right to free childcare, just like they have a right to a free public education. That really is not, that was not a full-throated argument that was being made until, again, truly over the past couple of years. And I'm painting with a broad brush. There were some people making that argument, but I mean, if we take a look at the sort of broadest swath of how politicians were talking about it, even how advocates were talking about it, they were not talking about it as a right. They were talking about how do we plus up this subsidy system that is targeting low income, is trying to help, a small number of low income families.
Yeah, one of the things that happened in the past decade is that there's been a lot of talk about professionalizing the field. And
Hmm.
so some people thinking that one reason for the lower investments in early childhood education before the age of 5 is because we needed to professionalize the workforce and, make them have more credentials. Now, there are many wonderful things to be said about this in
Yeah.
the sense that, as you mentioned earlier, our knowledge base has grown so exponentially. It takes a really talented, skilled, bright person to teach young children well. But what's your thoughts on this idea of professionalization and what has that gained us? And have there been any losses?
Yeah, so there's a tension, right, with the professionalization argument, which I understand and have talked to many people who sort of have made it, and I get where it's coming from. I think that there's a tension. The question is, do you want an early childhood educator to be compensated well, right, at the level of, say, a kindergarten or an elementary school teacher, to the point that they can, you know, make their own ends meet and they can, care for their own children, uh, because they have a certain degree, or because the work that they do is inherently valuable, and from a human perspective, like we are harming ourselves to pay those people, poverty wages essentially. And so I think part of the challenge with the credentialing argument is that, absent the compensation, you're
Mhm.
asking individuals to go and get these degrees to which they may not actually receive more money from. And so I actually, we're experiencing this right now with the question of like the student loans, and is the government going to compensate, or going to repay or give loans out to individuals in these fields because the pay is so low, right?
Mhm.
I remember having a conversation at one point in my career with a state higher education leader who told me, I'm not sure I can accredit like early childhood educator preparation programs because there's a requirement in state law that accredited programs lead to gainful employment. And this isn't gainful employment, like gainful in the sense of like you're making enough money to support yourself. And I'm like, that's an indictment of how we treat
Mhm.
this. So the question is, the theory was, if we ask everyone to get a degree, then we're going to be able to make more demands on getting better compensation. I don't know that that's been borne out. The other argument is, you fight for childcare as a right, early care and education as a right in and of itself, which inherently requires having, well compensated educators, and then you're going to be able to, at that point, continue to raise the quality bar once the money is in there. The other problem is turnover, right? When you are losing 40 to 50% of the workforce every single year, and they're not going across the street to another childcare program, they're going across the street to Target because they're going to make more money. And who can blame them, right? Then it's also really hard to professionalize a workforce at that point. So I think some of the current conversation about, do we think about the CDA kind of as like as an entry level kind of floor? Like, I think it's a perfectly reasonable conversation because the bar to get that's a lot lower than to get a full on degree. The other tension we should say is like the country is moving in a place, and I think largely the early care and education field is moving towards this idea of if you ask parents what kind of care they want, some of them will tell you that they want their kids in a licensed program. Lots of them will tell you they want their child with a grandparent or with a family member or with a neighbor or a trusted friend. And plenty of them will tell you that they want to take care of the kids themselves. And so if
Hmm.
what we're saying on the one hand is you have to have a degree or a certain level of credentials to provide effective, early education, then well, what does that mean for like the grandparent in that situation? Now, my argument in response to that is there's a qualitatively different set of skills that are required to run a classroom of like 8 toddlers, and make sure you're shepherding that development. Like all of you on this call know this, versus a grandparent taking care of their grandchild. But that is a tension we have to reckon with. Like, how do you, if you think about the arguments about professionalization, and then you think about the very large swath of families that are you taking advantage of, family friend and neighbor caregivers and other types of informal care, like that's a little bit at loggerheads.
What do you think we might do with respect to what you're saying in terms of a policy context?
Yeah, I think that the answer here is to go towards pluralism. Pluralism just meaning like you want to have a lots of different options that are available and that are all high quality. And they're going to necessarily look a little bit different. So there was actually an interesting proposal some of you may have seen, and I'll drop it in the link if you haven't. That came out just yesterday from a group that is more aligned with the Democratic Party and sort of thinking about like what's the next administration going to do if it happens to be Democratic. But they call it child care choice guarantee. And basically the idea is, give parents two options. Either they can send their kid to a high quality licensed program that's either home-based program or a center for free, or they can opt to get a stipend. Essentially, they call it a credit, a care credit, but like they get a stipend of $1,000 a month, and they can use that to either pay themselves if they're, taking care of the child themselves, or they can use it to pay, for an informal caregiver like a grandparent or again or a trusted friend or neighbor, and that is going to like those two paths are going to have different regulatory schemes necessarily. They're going to have different, expectations of what the programs are providing, and they're going to have different reporting requirements. But that's sort of idea of we want to create a system with multiple options, and each option is going to have a right size set of sort of regulations and expectations, to me is the way forward. We have to start, I think, if our ultimate goal is supporting kids and families, then we have to start by asking kids and families what they want. And then to, as much as possible, make sure that they have those options. So, another example of the We Vision Early Ed, program that the Bainham Foundation runs has been also kind of coming up with these
Mhm.
frameworks, thinking about like again multiple paths forward. So that to me is how we get out of this knot. Is instead of fighting about like credentials or no credentials or formal versus informal, we say we're going to have a system that supports all the different options and make sure all of them are high quality, make sure all of them are well supported, and that the caregiver child relationship is stable. Because as we know, that is the foundation of anything anyone would reasonably call quality. Is really hard to have if you don't have a stable, reliable relationship between the caregiver and the child.
But if we're going to support all children with all options, or even more children with more options, the price tag is going to increase no
It
matter
is.
what. How's that going to happen?
Yeah, look, I mean, so the price tag's such an interesting question, right? Like, because not all of us are sitting on like a big old pile of oil and natural gas like New Mexico, right? But I think what's interesting is we've seen states come we haven't seen the federal government did this yet, but states have come up with creative different ways to fund childcare expansion. So in Vermont, they did like a small payroll tax, right? And that's funding theirs. We've seen capital gains taxes in Washington State. We've seen other, in places like Massachusetts and DC, we've seen taxes on high net worth households. So there's not one way to fund it, but if what we're saying is this is vital social infrastructure that is going to undergird both America's families and all of the people who rely on them, and also undergird the strength of and health of our children and the upcoming generations, then the case is like we can't afford not to pay for it. We just need to figure out and argue how we're going to pay for it. And it's worth saying, so that proposal that I mentioned, which is just one proposal, I'm not saying it's perfect, But that would cost about $200 billion a year, is basically the estimate, right? And that's my estimates are, somewhere in 200 to $300 billion a year is probably what you need to really solve childcare in this country. That sounds like an awful lot of money. Honestly, Laura, this coming year, we're going to spend about $1 trillion in public money on K-12 education in this country, if you total up the federal, state, and local tax dollars going into it. $1 trillion. We spend over $600 billion on Medicare. We spend over $600 billion on Medicaid. So if what we're saying is $1 trillion for K-12, well, for the first 5 years, $200 billion, I could
Mhm.
argue that's kind of a steal, especially because it's more expensive on a per child basis to take care of the young children because of ratios. So I think there's sort of a two-step here. One is making the argument of like, yes, it's a large price tag and also it's worth it. Some things cost money and we want to pay for them, and we already do. We're paying for it one way or another, right? Like we're paying for it in lost wages and in lost family formation and in lost families staying in their communities that they're rooted in lost lives when we have public health and safety occupations that are understaffed because of childcare. So there's all of these ways that we're paying for it. So one is making the argument that we need to pay for it, and then the other is like there legitimately are ways to do it. Other states have figured this out. You can talk about, the estate tax, corporate, income tax. Like it's not insurmountable, but it is important that we be realistic. I will say one thing I find myself pushing back a little bit on is when you'll see some advocates sometimes say we're not even going to talk about how we pay for it. We don't want to have that conversation because it's too fraught. And like I think we have to. While it would be nice to say, like much like we fund the military in this country, we often don't think about how we're paying for it. We just deficit spend for major social programs. We do need to have an answer to the pay for question, I think.
Ask you to bring into this conversation equity issues and
Yeah.
also the changing demographics in our country. How do you
Yeah.
feel that the equity issues and the changing demographics, as particularly of young children, influences these issues of the financing and the child care and the credentialing and bring that into the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't have a conversation about childcare without talking about the overlays of race and gender, right? Like partially it's just dominated by women as the workforce. But also, what's the history of childcare in this country, right? When some of the first non-kin caregivers were enslaved girls and women, like when we have a long history of devaluing care work generally because of who did that. So and right now, obviously, there's disproportionate lack of access, among historically disenfranchised populations. So, given that history, you have to confront it, right? We have to, as a nation, unlearn some of these old stereotypes and some of these like, about uh, who cares for our children, what's the value of care, who is worthy of support for care. A lot of that is there, and I would argue we saw this flare right back up, in the beginning of this year with the whole conversation about the Somali run programs in Minnesota, and I think it's pretty hard to look at that episode objectively and think there weren't components of race involved in there as well. So that's I think part of the this puzzle is being able to go directly at that history and say, like, we're not going to treat care that way anymore. We are not going to let this fall on the shoulders of women anymore and exploit their unpaid labor or underpaid labor in order to care for individuals in this country. The other piece about the demographic change, which I'm glad you brought up, is we're an aging country, right? We are at the turn of the millennium. About 1 in 8, 1 in 9 Americans were over the age of 85. By 2040, it's going to be 1 in 4. Right? We're by 2050, Americans over the age of 85 are going to outnumber Americans under the age of 5. Like we're getting very, very old, very, very quickly. And that is a couple of implications. One, it means that we're going to have a lot of sandwich generation caregivers. I imagine many on the call already are, right? So someone is caring for a minor child and also caring for an aged parent or other loved one. And that's an additional kind of pressure on the family budget. The other thing is it's going to create headwinds to this conversation about care, about childcare, because if there's a limited pot of money, and this goes to your question about how do we pay for things, it might be nice to say, here's $200 billion we could use to pay for childcare. There are going to be people saying we need that money to make Social Security whole, right? We need that money to make Medicaid whole or Medicare whole rather, because Social Security trust funds are on track to for partial insolvency by 2032. That's not a long way away. The next president is going to have to deal with Social Security, and so I think we have to get creative in how we have these conversations. Catherine
Yes.
Edwards. Sorry, if I can say real quick, Catherine Edwards, who's an economist, had a piece out recently. She's talking about while you're reforming Social Security, you could actually use that to you should use a reformed Social Security as a way to offer universal paid family leave. You could use a reformed Social Security system to create a child trust fund alongside the old age trust funds and use that to help for child care. Like we have to get out of our silo because the other fact is of the demographic change is that parents with young children who are already wildly outnumbered in the electorate by non-parents of young children are going to be a shrinking portion
Mhm.
of the electorate because we're also having fewer children.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, oftentimes in the early childhood education, we're working within our silo
Yeah.
among ourselves. And so what you're saying is really pointing the needs to really create really strong and effective coalitions with other kinds of causes and other kinds of groups. And so can you speak to that? What might we do next to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is we need to actually start having these conversations, I think, with partners and allies in related fields. So, I mean, I'm curious how many people on this call have been in a room with paid leave advocates, right? Like paid leave, those are the two most closely connected issues you can think of, right? Like paid parental leave is literally like infant child care. Like those two, it covers the first
Hmm.
few months of an infant's life, and it also reduces pressure on child care programs because infant care is obviously very hard to deliver. So, but child care and paid leave don't move together. Like they're sort of separate advocacy and policy ecosystems. There's some crossover, but like I've talked to plenty of congressional staffers who say, I hear frequently from child care groups. I hear very rarely from paid leave groups, or I know a lot about child care. I don't know a lot about paid leave. The same staffer who I'm like, how are you not dealing with both of these issues together? But that's because of how we approach it in this country. So we've separated paid leave over here. We've taken school-aged childcare, which again, literally childcare, but just for a slightly different age group, and we've put that over there. And we said, here's early child, here's birth to five, as if this is a different thing. And by the way, half of the families in America that have a young child also have a school-aged child. So half of our like direct constituency care about school-aged care. And then there's the folks who are working on elder care. So there are a few groups that carrying across generations that are trying to do this work, but it is remarkably underbaked for what you would imagine. So part of it is we need to create, if either go to those tables or create those tables and say, if we're going to the state house or going to Congress and we're going to advocate for childcare, like grab a paid leave person and like let's go together and like let's have this conversation about the ways in which our two issues connect. Grab an elder care advocate. Let's talk a conversation about how we deal with care across the generations. And we may even need to think about policy solutions that span multiple issue areas. So there was in 2019, a proposal came out from the National Academy for Social Insurance that basically said, could you do a social insurance system similar to how we pay into Social Security and Medicare, but for care more broadly? Like, could you do like a single point of entry where the same fund is paying out for child care and long-term supportive services for those with disabilities and for elder care issues? Like those are just they're more creative conversations than I think we have always sometimes had. Sometimes we do get very, very narrow on what we're talking about. So part of how we break down that silo is not at the risk of sounding trite, like is by breaking down the silo and by being willing to actually like engage in those conversations with people working on related issues.
Let me ask you a question. If you could really speak frankly, how
Yeah.
effective are we right now in early childhood education in the policy space sphere. So we talked about the practice
Yeah.
sphere a little bit, but how effective are we right now? And what can we do?
Um, yeah. So I think on like levels of like passion and dedication, and like we're off the charts on like actual must like effectiveness. Early care and education is a relatively weak field, and I that's descriptive. And what I mean by that is like one thing, for example, that the ECE field does very, very little of is direct big P politics. Like we will send advocacy, C3 advocacy groups to have a rally or to talk to someone or to do public education, or we'll bring the cute kids with us. Uh, we're not giving out money to through PACs and other kinds of mechanisms to candidates. And we're not like the League of Conservation Voters was the fourth or fifth largest uh, contributor, politically speaking, in the 2024 election cycle. You better bet that those candidates, and then when they became elected, those people in power pay attention when the League of Conservation Voters come around to talk about environmental issues. I
Mhm.
once had a child care advocate say, and it's always stuck in my head, she has two aphorisms. I think both are excellent. One is don't confuse proximity to power with power. So just because you can get a meeting with someone or get a photo op with someone doesn't actually mean you can influence their behavior. The second thing is if you can't help get a politician into office or get them out of office, you aren't demanding anything, you're just asking nicely. And I think
Mhm.
that our field does a lot of asking nicely. And that's not like a slight because part of it goes back to funding and philanthropy. Because the next question is, well, where's that money coming from? Why can the League of Conservation Voters do that? Because they have donors that are willing to write very large checks that they're not going to be able to write off of their taxes. There's going to, a political action committee or other kind of, mechanism to spend on elections. But that's a question. You guys, what do we do about it? Like, we need to get better and we need to start to build up a donor base that says this isn't getting done by asking nicely. Like, we have to stop showing up to the political racetrack in a horse and buggy.
Wow. What are some trends that you see that that would be positively moving us in the right direction
Yeah.
other than
So
writing
I'm
the big check?
So I mentioned that like, things that kind of dour history that I painted has started to change in just the past few years, and it truly has. So right, so we because of two things. One is we have empirical examples of states that are making huge strides in how much public money they're putting in. So New Mexico is like the canonical example we have, right? For universal and free, so at least so long as you have all of your parents working or in or in school. Uh, and then all of the positive press that got, all of the sort of impact we're starting to see, they've had like a massive increase in the number of families served. What Mayor Mamdani did in New York City, both in his campaign and now, in terms of like foregrounding childcare. And we've seen this, so more and more and more candidates even in this cycle are talking about universal childcare. They're talking about, we're hearing it much, much, much more than we have even a few years ago. Let's say you have universal childcare, right? This proposal that came out that childcare should be free for every family. Like we're getting away, it feels like to me, from this means tested. Don't want anyone paying more than 7% of their income. Like, I'm sorry, no one knows what 7% of their income is. It's a meaningless statistic. And so that is, I think, positive. We have to, I think, grab those reins and run with it. Like there is a moment right now that there is momentum, there is energy, and I think the question is, how do we capture that? How do we stop childcare just from becoming like a catchphrase, or what we have to build out the policy underneath it? We need to build out the pay for underneath it. We have to take advantage of this moment. But I'll tell you, and I'm curious if this is your experience too. I don't remember personally or reading the history a time when there's been this much energy towards truly transformational early care and education policy, at least not in my lifetime.
I would agree with you on that. I mean, definitely when I was in graduate school in the 1970s, I don't think anybody even knew the words child care, who was the politician, more or less. So there's definitely a lot more energy and a lot more conversation right now than I think there has ever been. But as you said, we have to harness that into some effective strategies in order to take advantage of that moment. One reason why I mentioned that is because a question that I have is around business strategies and our
Hmm.
partnership with the business community. Again, this is something that, there have been really important efforts since the 1980s to really bring the business community into the conversation and into the work of doing childcare. Where's that standing right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you brought it because it has been a long-standing kind of effort, and I think some people think that we just sort of just started to ask business to help. There's a great 1985 New York Times piece called "Childcare Finds a Champion in the Corporation," and there's this picture of this giant baby standing next to like a tall office tower. So it has been a while. I think there are kind of two trends, I would say, around the business question. One is there's definitely movement to try to get businesses to offer childcare as a benefit to their employees. So we see this with some of the reforms to the tax credits for businesses in the HR1, the Republican Reconciliation Bill from the summer. We see that in this sort of expansion of these tri-share programs. I am personally more skeptical of that. I think that it's not a scalable solution because small businesses can't offer that. We actually see a lot of businesses change their minds. Google, General Mills, Simons have all closed the childcare programs that were attached to their campuses in recent years. And three, it treats childcare like we don't run rights through the business sort of employer-employee relationship any more than it hasn't worked super well for healthcare. And we don't ask, businesses to offer their employees the third grade or to give them like a stipend to go purchase the third grade, right? It makes you laugh, but like that's kind of what we're doing. So that's like one trend which I'm personally more skeptical of, though people I respect disagree, and that's totally fine. The other trend, which I think is really exciting, though, is we're seeing more and more business leaders step up around the need for public solutions. So Vermont is a great example of this. In Vermont, when they basically proposed a large childcare reform bill that would be built off of a small payroll tax, like I mentioned, 75% of which would be borne by the employer, they had business leader after business leader after business leader go before the Vermont legislature and basically say, look, if you need to tax us, do it. Like, we're not going to come after you in the next election. We're going to like give you the air cover that you need, but we can't solve this ourselves. We know it's an issue. It's an issue for us personally as business leaders, it's an issue for our communities. And in the case of Vermont, isn't to your point about demographic change, it's an issue for the state because the state was bleeding families with young children to other states. And so they passed with that payroll tax, and that has powered a really impressive expansion has made childcare much more affordable for families. There's been an expansion in childcare supply, including in rural areas among family childcare providers. Childcare educator wages are going up, like all these positive things that are happening. And they really would not have happened had the business community not come together in Vermont and said to the government, we need you to do this and we're going to back you up. So that to me is the positive. And I hope that more states follow that model of organizing businesses, not just to provide childcare as a benefit to their employees, but to provide businesses to leverage their political muscle for public solutions.
That is a different strategy than we saw in the 80s, for example.
Yes.
So that would be really interesting. I'm wondering if we might talk because you just talked about how people in our field aren't writing those big checks to politicians. Well,
Yeah.
in addition, so the big money checks, it may be something we don't have, but I'll tell you something else we don't have, and that's time. Because
Hmm.
many of the practitioners in our field, even in terms of this webinar, they're with children right now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and they don't have flexible work schedules and they're not working at home. Even people who are family childcare providers working at home cannot, they're with children.
Yeah.
So the time factor becomes a huge factor as well
Yep.
compared to some of the other groups that you mentioned who have the time as well as the money to invest in this work. What are some ways that we as practitioners can overcome the things that we don't have and maximize the things that we do have?
Yeah. That's a great question. And you're absolutely right. It's very, very difficult. Excuse me. I think there are a couple of things we can do. One is we can invite politicians in, right? Like, so politicians love a good photo op with cute kids. But I will say, like, I have heard and talked to politicians myself and heard many stories of when they would get an elected leader they come into a childcare program for a day and they leave with like their eyes wide, like, because they're like, I had no idea, like, that is incredibly skillful work, right? Like, there is a lot of education happening. And I remember hearing one story of a childcare provider. I think it was a family childcare provider who, when the politician was leaving, handed the politician a check and said, "Here are your wages for the day." Right. And it, because they
Mhm.
got, and that apparently stuck with that politician, like, to the point that they told that story regularly. Like, that really made an impact, right? So we can invite people in, because part of the issue with childcare is that, again, especially elected leaders don't always know, especially if they're older, don't necessarily know what's happening inside of a program. So they may have an old view of, this is, again, this is babysitting, right? This is custodial. This is different than when I go to the pre-K center that is attached to the school. And so we can also, I think, really leverage things like social media. Like, the fact is that a lot of the voters don't know what's going on inside childcare programs. So the more that we can invite them in to say, like, look, here's what's happening. Like, look at this great, activity we're doing. Look how these kids, right? Like, how much they're learning, how much joy there is, because it cuts against all those arguments that make me so mad about how, like, childcare is this like very reluctant thing that is all terrible, and everyone's crying. Like, no, like, that's good childcare programs are amazing, but most people haven't seen them. Even if you're a parent of a young child, you may not have seen it, right? Because you drop the kid off at the front and you pick them at the end, but like, are you actually seeing all of the interactions that are happening? And then to, again, talk very honestly about those experiences and I think also to be able to talk with parents. Like, I don't, it's fraught to talk about money and things like that, but it's important that parents understand why childcare education is getting paid so poorly, and the fact that it's a policy choice. Because that's the other thing I think we can really do. We don't have to go to the state house to do this, is to make elected leaders, make the voters understand how much of this is a choice, and there are different choices that we can make.
Mhm.
So I think those are some of the ways that we can, even despite these sort of barriers. The thing I'll say too is, like, there's also, when sometimes push comes to shove and there have to be direct action. So some of you are probably familiar with the morning without childcare or day without
Mhm.
childcare effort, right? Like, this idea of, like, we're gonna go to the Capitol because we're not serving kids today because we can barely keep our doors open, and like, we need our politicians to understand how much of this state, how much of our community relies on there being a good childcare system. So I think there's something to be said for that too. And, it is interesting talking to people who participated in that effort. A lot of them were really worried their parents were going to be really mad that they served, because and they didn't want to put those parents out, because a lot of those parents are also, hardworking, and they don't have a lot of give in their own lives either. But my understanding is, by and large, the parents are very supportive. The parents were like, yeah, look, this isn't sustainable, and like, I'd rather deal with not having childcare for one day than you closing and me not having childcare at all. So
Absolutely. Well, let me give you a little bit of time before we come to the close, because one of the things that you've been working on very specifically has been this idea of climate change in childhood.
yeah.
So I'd really like for you to share some thoughts about that with our listeners today.
Sure. I mean, so I think a lot of this sort of conversation about climate change misses the fact that young children in particular are uniquely affected by a lot of the climate and change enhanced hazards, and that childcare programs can actually be really important assets in climate response, for two reasons. Like, one, because those early habits of mind that are happening, right, in terms of learning to enjoy the natural environment, learning about the world around us, that those habits start in early childhood. The other thing is that childcare programs are often the only connection point that families have when the children are very young. So when I was part of an effort, it was an early years climate action task force, and we heard a lot of testimony from different providers, and it was two stories that stuck with me. One was a provider in the North Bay of San Francisco when they had awful wildfires some years back. That childcare program was the one that was getting supplies and making contact with its families. The county didn't have any other way of figuring out where those families were. And so they were the ones that were making databases. And like the other one that stood out to me is, there's a family childcare provider in Florida who testified about how after one of the hurricanes, with like a roof basically like half on, like, she hustled to get up and running within like 4 days so that she could serve the children of first responders, right? So if the nurses and the firefighters and the other recovery personnel, who need it. So when we talk about climate resilience in communities, very often early care and education isn't part of that conversation. If you go through climate action plans, very often you don't see child care programs or pre-K or so anything in the early years mentioned in those plans, and it's a real miss. So one thing I would say is, within almost every community, almost every state has some kind of response going on. In the current political environment, we don't always call it climate change anymore, but there's something going on about how do we respond to be prepared, increase our resilience against extreme weather. And I think making sure that the early care and education sector is at the table is really important. And there are some good examples. So in California had a big grant program to basically upgrade childcare facilities, and there's the low income investment fund helped to administer that, and a lot of that went to childcare facilities. There's work that's happening in like New York City because so many of their family childcare programs are in basements, and in extreme precipitation events they flood, and so again grants going out for like things like regrading. You wouldn't think that would be like a massively important thing to do, but actually it turns out if you regrade a backyard so that's even instead of tilted, and the next time there's a big storm, the water isn't running into the basement, you may have just saved a childcare program. So all of those, I hope we have more and more conversations around that, and we take advantage of the existing resources.
Well, thank you. That's very important. One last thing I want to ask you about is because we always want to recognize our workforce when we have these conversations and really recognize the practitioners, the people who are actually working with children. And I wonder what wisdom you would share with the early childhood workforce right now in terms of thinking about their well-being, what would strengthen them and support them at this point. What are the best thing we could do right now to really uplift and support the early childhood education workforce?
Yeah, don't know how many ways to say pay them better, like right, like I
Okay,
mean
that's number one.
that's number one, but truly, like I think it's the idea that we are asking the workforce to continue to do um, this work on poverty wages at a time when the cost of living is only going up is not tenable. So I do think that pushing our politicians for any kind of direct wage supplementation doesn't have like so DC's pay equity fund is like the gold standard, right? This idea of we're going to create pay parity between early childhood educators and K-12 educators of similar experience and credentials to our earlier conversation, like, and that resulted in 10, 15 plus $1,000 raises. Like, great. They also created a special status on their Affordable Care Act exchange marketplace where early childhood educators could get essentially free healthcare. Great.
Mhm.
Not every place is going to do that. Something though, places that have done various forms of workforce grants, right? So even if it's, a few $1,000s over the course of a year, even if it's giving, a tax credit, like a refundable tax credit like Louisiana has, for tax time, any of those things, I think are ways of acknowledging that educators are doing, really, really important work and that they're not getting paid nearly enough. I mean, we can talk about other sort of smaller ways to honor that work, but fundamentally, like, I think we need to be bold enough to say, look, like it's if you're not increasing compensation, like you don't have a plan for reforming and improving childcare. You just don't. And so I think politicians need to hear that. I think we sometimes shy away. We can be too nice about because we don't want to lose the small amount of support that we have sometimes. But I've said this before, and I'll say it again. If any policymaker doesn't have a plan to substantially raise the compensation for the early childhood workforce, does not have an early childhood plan.
Well, that's the word right there. And so I think that's a great place to end our conversation because that is the bottom line for our workforce. They need to be paid better and also have the respect and honor for the level of skill and talent it takes to do their jobs well. Do you have any final comments you'd like to share? And again, we want to invite all of our listeners to join our after party for a private conversation with Elliot if you would like. Elliot, last word on you.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, thank you again. Thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day to listen. All the work you do is so important. I would say my last word would be think about within your own community who the unusual messengers are that aren't yet out there making the case for childcare. So police chiefs is a good example. We've seen this in a few communities where the police chief has become an incredibly important spokesperson for public investments in early care and education because they'll say, "Look, I don't have enough officers. Like my response time is going to be low to your 911 call because of childcare issues." Like that gets people's attention in a way that it may not hear it as well from someone else. Clergy, right? Like military leaders, if you happen to be near like a military base, right? Because we know that lots of military bases require the childcare in the surrounding community. Like find those unusual messengers and make those unusual messages that we in this day and age hammer very hard the economic message that this is going to improve labor force participation rates. This is going to improve business productivity. That's true. It only opens the door so far. Occasionally, we'll hammer the child development argument, but sort of my entire case in my latest book, Raising a Nation, is like there are a lot of cases you can make that are going to reach people who are approaching this sort of question from a different standpoint. And we have got to convince the folks who don't have young children, who don't have children at all. Like, if we can't convince them, we're not going to get where we need to go because there just aren't enough of parents of young children. And frankly, there are plenty of parents of young children who aren't convinced that this needs to be a public solution because they're still bought into this idea that it's a private family responsibility. And if they have trouble, affording childcare, that's their problem. And we need to, I think, more forcefully say this is a policy choice. There are alternatives. We now don't even have to look to other countries. We can now look within the United States and point to examples to say, look, why is it that if you drive 100 miles in that direction, you can get free high quality childcare, but you're going to struggle, you're going to pay more than your rent or your mortgage, and you're going to be sitting on a wait list that's, years long. So I would just say, think about within your own contexts, who are the unusual messengers, who are the unusual messages that you can use.
Thank you so much, Elliot. I really appreciate that you've shared your knowledge base in a very accessible way to help us all understand and think about what we can do next. Thanks for your knowledge and thanks for the wisdom you've offered. For all of you who are listening, we want to again invite you to join us at the after party for a private conversation with Elliot. If you would like to join us, please click the link that you will find in the chat. We also want to invite you to join us next month and the months after as we continue with the CAYL Catalyst, Reflect for Insight and Reset for Action. Next month, we're going to have Rosemarie Allen, followed by Bonnie and Roger Negebauer, and then with Walter Gilliam. And we invite and encourage you to join us. So wonderful, always having all of you month after month to have these conversations with us. We really appreciate that you've been part of the CAYL community. I'll see you at the after party. Good night.